The rain fell in sheets against the windows of Ashford Manor, each droplet a small surrender to gravity, a tiny defeat that mirrored the one taking place within Eleanor Ashford's heart. She stood in her father's study, her hands clasped before her with the perfect deportment 22 years of gentle breeding had instilled, while the man who had given her life and who was now, it seemed, taking it back, could not meet her eyes. Lord Richard Ashford had aged a decade in the past year. His shoulders bowed beneath burdens Eleanor had only begun to understand, and as he spoke of debts and obligations and arrangements that had been made for her future, she watched the autumn rain trace paths down the glass like tears she would not allow herself to shed. "The Duke of Greystone has agreed to settle our debts," her father said, and each word fell heavy as stone into the silence between them, "in exchange for, that is to say, he requires." But Eleanor understood before he finished. She had always been a practical girl, had always known that women of her station were currency as much as they were people, and so she nodded with a grace that cost her everything and said simply, "I understand, Father." She had dreamed once, in the way young women do, of a husband who might love her, of a home filled with warmth rather than obligation, of children born from affection rather than duty. Those dreams dissolved now like morning mist, insubstantial things that had never truly belonged to her. The contract arrived 3 days later in a leather portfolio, delivered by a stern-faced solicitor who waited in uncomfortable silence while Eleanor read terms that reduced her future to ink and parchment. There was no mention of companionship or regard, no softness in the language that bound her to a man she had never met. The Duke of Greystone required an heir and a hostess. She would provide both. In return, her family would be saved from ruin. It was, the document assured her in its cold, legalistic prose, a most equitable arrangement. Eleanor signed her name in careful script, each letter a small death of hope, and as she set down the pen, she caught her reflection in the window, a pale girl with dark eyes that held too much understanding, too much resignation. Outside, the rain continued its relentless fall, and Eleanor thought that perhaps this was fitting, that her wedding should be preceded by such morning skies. She was to be a duchess, her father said with forced brightness. She was to have every material comfort. What she would not have, what the contract made brutally clear in its omissions, was the one thing she had secretly hoped for, the possibility of being loved. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. Now, let's begin. The wedding day dawned grey and sullen, as though the heavens themselves disapproved of the union about to take place beneath them. Greystone Cathedral rose from the moorland like a rebuke, all dark stone and narrow windows that seemed to admit light only grudgingly, and as Eleanor's carriage approached through the mist, she thought it looked less like a place of holy celebration and more like a beautiful tomb. The attendance was sparse, a necessity of discretion, she supposed, for what family wished to broadcast that their daughter had been sold to settle debts? Her father sat beside her in the carriage, his hand trembling as he patted hers with a reassurance neither of them believed, and when they entered the cathedral, Eleanor counted perhaps 20 souls scattered among pews that could hold hundreds, their faces curious and pitying in equal measure. And then she saw him. Duke Adrian Thornwell stood at the altar, with the rigid posture of a man facing execution rather than matrimony, and Eleanor's breath caught despite everything, despite all her resigned practicality, because he was beautiful in the way that winter itself is beautiful, all sharp lines and cold perfection. His dark hair was immaculately groomed, his features aristocratic and severe, his tall frame clothed in formal attire that spoke of wealth and taste and utter indifference to the woman walking toward him. He did not smile as she approached. He did not soften. He simply watched her progress down the aisle with eyes the color of storm clouds, and Eleanor felt herself being measured and catalogued, and found adequate for his purposes nothing more. The ceremony unfolded with mechanical precision, each word spoken by the priest falling into the vast emptiness of the cathedral like stones into a well. Eleanor made her vows in a voice that did not shake, though her hands trembled as Adrian slipped the ring onto her finger with the impersonal efficiency of a man completing a transaction. His own vows were delivered in a deep voice devoid of warmth, and when the priest pronounced them man and wife, Adrian did not kiss her. He merely offered his arm, a gesture of form rather than affection, and led her back down the aisle toward the doors and the grey day beyond. It was as they stood in the cathedral vestibule, preparing for the journey to Greystone Hall, that he spoke his first direct words to her. "We should establish an understanding, Lady Eleanor," he said, and the title that should have been replaced by some endearment remained coldly formal. "This marriage is a business arrangement. You will have every material comfort, every courtesy due your position, but you must not." And here his eyes met hers with brutal honesty. "Expect love from this marriage. I cannot give what I do not possess." Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest. Some small, stubborn hope she had not known she still harbored, but she merely inclined her head with the dignity her mother had taught her and said, "I understand, Your Grace." The carriage ride to Greystone Hall stretched before them in silence, miles of moorland passing outside the windows, while inside two strangers sat as far apart as the confines allowed, and Eleanor understood with absolute clarity that she had not married a man but rather a beautiful, impenetrable fortress, and she had not the faintest idea how to breach its walls. Greystone Hall rose before them like something from a Gothic novel, all severe towers and mullioned windows, its grey stone walls seeming to absorb rather than reflect what little light the overcast sky provided. Eleanor had thought the cathedral cold, but it was nothing compared to this fortress of a house, this monument to isolation that was now to be her home. As the carriage rolled to a stop before the imposing entrance, she felt the weight of the building pressing down upon her spirits, and she wondered if happiness had ever existed within these walls, or if the very architecture forbade it. The staff assembled to greet them was as sparse and austere as everything else. A stern-faced housekeeper named Mrs. Davies, a butler whose expression suggested he had long ago forgotten how to smile, and perhaps a dozen others who stood in perfect formation, their efficiency evident in every pressed uniform and rigid posture. Adrian acknowledged them with a brief nod and then, without ceremony or warmth, gestured for Eleanor to follow him inside. The tour was perfunctory, almost insulting in its brevity. He walked her through the main floor with the enthusiasm of a man showing a stranger around a property for let. The drawing room, with its heavy drapes and darker furniture, the dining hall with its absurdly long table, the library whose volumes might have interested her had he allowed her more than a passing glance, the music room with its silent pianoforte gathering dust. His commentary was minimal. "This is the East Wing, the portrait gallery. My study, which is private," and with each clipped phrase, Eleanor felt herself being assigned her place in this household, which was to say, no place at all. They climbed the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space, and Adrian led her down a long corridor to the West Wing. "These will be your rooms," he said, opening double doors to reveal a suite that was undeniably beautiful, all silk wallpaper and fine furniture, and windows overlooking the grounds and utterly impersonal. "You'll find everything you require. Mrs. Davies will attend to any needs." He paused at the threshold, making no move to enter, and Eleanor understood with sudden, painful clarity that he would not be crossing this threshold again. "My chambers are in the East Wing," he continued, confirming what she had already intuited. "I keep early hours, I ride at dawn and attend to estate business throughout the day. We will maintain separate schedules. You are, of course, mistress of this house, and may order it as you see fit within reason." Within reason, as though she might overstep, might presume too much upon her position as his wife. Eleanor stood in the center of what was now her cage, however gilded, and nodded once more, that slight incline of her head that was becoming her signature gesture of acceptance. "I understand, Your Grace." He left her then, his footsteps receding down the corridor, and Eleanor sank onto the edge of the enormous four-poster bed, suddenly exhausted by the weight of her isolation. That evening, she dressed for dinner in one of her finest gowns, a futile gesture of dignity, and descended to the dining hall to find Adrian already seated at the head of the table, the very distant head, with what seemed like miles of polished mahogany stretching between them. They ate in silence, the scrape of silver against china, the only sound in that vast room, and Eleanor understood that this was to be her life, beautiful, comfortable, and utterly, devastatingly alone. Weeks passed in a strange, suspended existence where Eleanor found herself living as a ghost in her own home. Adrian kept to his word with almost military precision. He was gone before she woke, though evidence of his presence lingered in the breakfast room. A half-empty coffee cup, a newspaper folded to the financial pages, the faint scent of his cologne in the air. She would take her solitary breakfast and listen to the silence of the vast house, a silence so complete it seemed to have weight and texture, and she would wonder if it were possible to be married and yet more alone than she had ever been in her unmarried life. The manor itself became both her companion and her prison, as she explored its countless rooms with the dedication of someone who had nothing else to occupy her time. She discovered beauty in unexpected places, a conservatory where winter light filtered through glass panes to illuminate exotic plants someone had once cared for, a music room where dust motes danced in shafts of pale sun, and corridors lined with portraits of Thornwell's past, who stared down at her with expressions ranging from stern disapproval to vague melancholy. Everything was exquisitely maintained, perfectly appointed, and utterly devoid of warmth, as though the house itself had absorbed its master's emotional temperature and reflected it back in polished marble and cold stone. The library became her refuge, a vast room with floor-to-ceiling shelves that held what must have been thousands of volumes. Eleanor would spend entire afternoons there, curled in a window seat with whatever book had caught her interest, losing herself in other lives and other worlds, because her own seemed too small and too large, all at once, too small in its emotional scope, too large in its echoing emptiness. She noticed the books were well loved, their spines cracked with reading, and she wondered who had loved them before her, whose hands had turned these pages, whose heart had sought escape in these same stories. From the library windows, she could see the gardens, or what had once been gardens, now overgrown and wild, though even in their neglect they held a melancholic beauty that called to something in her spirit. Occasionally, so rarely it seemed almost accidental, she would encounter Adrian in the corridors. These meetings followed an invariable pattern. He would pause, incline his head with perfect courtesy, and murmur, "Lady Eleanor," in that formal tone that kept her at a distance more effectively than any locked door, and continue on his way. She learned to read the subtle signs of his passage through the house, the sound of his study door closing, the murmur of his voice discussing estate matters with his steward, the sight of him through windows riding across the moor on his black stallion, always away, always departing. She wrote letters home, carefully cheerful missives to her father that described the beauty of the manor and the generosity of her husband's provision, lies of omission that cost her more than truth would have. The letters went unanswered. She understood her father's shame was too great, his relief at her sacrifice too profound. She had saved her family by disappearing into this cold, beautiful place, and they were content to let her disappear completely, to pretend she had never existed rather than face what they had done. The library had become Eleanor's sanctuary, her haven from the oppressive silence of the rest of the manor, and she had fallen into the habit of spending entire afternoons there with a kind of desperate constancy, as though the accumulated wisdom of centuries might somehow teach her how to live in this beautiful prison. She was deep in a volume of romantic poetry, Wordsworth's Meditations on Solitude speaking to her own isolation, when the door opened and Adrian entered with the purposeful stride of someone who had forgotten anyone else might occupy the space. He stopped short at the sight of her, genuine surprise flickering across his features, the first unguarded expression she had seen on his face, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other across the expanse of Persian carpet and leather furniture. "Lady Eleanor," he said at last, and she heard something in his voice that might have been discomfort, as though her presence here was an intrusion he had not anticipated. "I did not realize you. I was unaware you used the library." Eleanor closed her book, marking her place with one finger, and rose with the careful grace that had become her armor against his coldness. "I hope I am not trespassing, Your Grace. You did say I was mistress of the house." Something shifted in his expression. Was it chagrin? "Of course. You misunderstand. I merely meant, I had thought the room unused. It pleases me to know the collection is appreciated." He moved toward the shelves with what seemed like reluctance, or perhaps it was hesitation, and Eleanor noticed for the first time how his hand trailed along the spines of books as though greeting old friends. "You have an extraordinary collection," Eleanor ventured, emboldened by what might have been the first civil exchange they had managed since their wedding day. "I have never seen its equal outside of London." Adrian's hand paused on a volume of Shakespeare, and his voice when he spoke held a quality she had not heard before, something softer, something almost human. "My mother collected them. She was a great reader, spent hours in this room. After He stopped abruptly, as though he had revealed too much, and his hand dropped from the shelf. She had excellent taste. The past tense hung heavy between them, and Eleanor understood that she was glimpsing something he had not meant to show her: a wound, a loss, a piece of the man beneath the ice. She must have been a remarkable woman, Eleanor said gently, to have assembled such a collection, to have loved literature so deeply. For a moment, just a breath, just a heartbeat, Adrian's eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that was neither cold nor distant, but rather infinitely sad, infinitely weary. She was, he said quietly. Then, as though suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment, the crack in his carefully constructed walls, he straightened, and his expression shuttered closed once more. "I came for a volume on estate management. I will not disturb you further." He retrieved his book with swift efficiency and was gone before Eleanor could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft finality that somehow felt like a door slamming. But Eleanor sank back into her chair with her heart beating faster than it had in weeks, because she had seen it, that flicker of something real beneath his coldness, that glimpse of a man who felt and hurt and remembered. He was not made of stone, after all, and that knowledge, dangerous though it might be, bloomed in her chest like hope. The library encounter, brief though it had been, changed something fundamental in Eleanor's perception of her husband. She found herself watching for him now, not with hope exactly, she had learned better than that, but with a growing curiosity that proved more dangerous than hope had ever been. She began to notice the patterns of his days, the rhythms of a life that ran parallel to hers without ever truly intersecting, and in those observations she discovered contradictions that fascinated and confused her in equal measure. He rode at dawn without fail, and Eleanor took to waking early simply to watch from her window as he departed across the moor, his figure dark against the pale morning sky. There was something almost desperate in the way he rode, as though he were trying to outrun something that followed him always, and she wondered what demons chased a man who seemed to have everything. He would return an hour later, his horse lathered and his own face flushed with exertion, and she would see him at the stables, gentling the animal with hands that were surprisingly tender, speaking to it in low tones that carried a warmth entirely absent from his voice when he addressed her. One morning, Eleanor was walking the corridors when she heard Adrian's voice coming from the servants' quarters, an area she had learned was considered his domain rather than hers. She paused, hidden by the turn of the corridor, and listened as he spoke with old Mr. Henderson, the head gardener who had served the family for 40 years, and whose hands now trembled with age. Adrian's voice was gentle, concerned, asking after the man's health and his daughter's children, insisting he take more rest and leave the heavy work to younger hands. There was genuine affection in his tone, real care, and Eleanor felt something twist in her chest because this was the voice of a man capable of warmth, of connection, of kindness, none of which he had ever extended to her. She saw it again in the way he dealt with Mrs. Davies, listening patiently to the housekeeper's concerns about the aging roof and the need for repairs, his attention focused and respectful. She observed him with his steward, discussing tenant concerns with what appeared to be genuine interest in their welfare. He was not, she realized with growing confusion, a cruel man. He was not even, by nature, a cold man. He was simply cold to her, specifically and deliberately cold to her, and that hurt worse than if his coldness had been universal. Eleanor spent long hours in the library, no longer reading but staring out at the gardens and trying to understand the puzzle of Adrian Thornwell. What had made him this way? What had carved out the warmth from his heart and left only this shell that functioned beautifully in every capacity except the one that mattered to her? The lost mother, mentioned so briefly, was surely part of it, but Eleanor sensed there was more, some deeper wound that had taught him to lock away whatever capacity for love he possessed. Her curiosity became a kind of torment, because knowing he could be warm made his coldness toward her feel less like inability and more like choice, and she did not know which was worse. It began with a cough. Eleanor heard it through the heavy oak door of Adrian's study, as she passed one afternoon, a deep, racking sound that spoke of illness being stubbornly ignored. She paused, her hand halfway to her own door, and heard it again, followed by the shuffle of papers and the scratch of pen on parchment. He was working through it, of course. Men like Adrian Thornwell did not permit themselves the weakness of illness, did not allow something so mundane as physical suffering to interrupt the relentless machinery of duty and obligation. Eleanor stood in the corridor for a long moment, warring with herself. He had made it abundantly clear he wanted nothing from her, no softness, no care, no intrusion into the carefully partitioned life he maintained. To offer comfort would likely be rebuffed, and she had suffered enough small rejections to last a lifetime. Yet she found herself moving toward the kitchens anyway, found herself asking cook for honey and fresh ginger, found herself brewing tea with her own hands while the kitchen staff watched with barely concealed curiosity. She added herbs. Her mother had taught her thyme for the throat, chamomile for its soothing properties, and poured the steaming liquid into one of the house's finest china cups. The walk to Adrian's study felt longer than it should have, her heart beating with an anxiety she tried to dismiss as foolish. She knocked softly, waited, received no answer. The coughing had stopped, but she could hear the continued scratch of his pen. Eleanor made her decision quickly. Before courage could desert her, she opened the door just enough to slip inside, placed the tea on the corner of his massive desk where he could not fail to see it, and left without speaking, without waiting to see his reaction, without giving him the opportunity to refuse her small offering. She heard his pen pause as the door closed behind her, but nothing more. The next morning, walking past his study on some invented errand, Eleanor glanced through the half-open door and saw the cup sitting empty on a side table, waiting to be collected by the staff. He had not thanked her. He had not acknowledged the gesture in any way. But the cup was empty, and that somehow felt like enough. It became a pattern after that small, silent gestures that Eleanor offered without expectation of recognition or gratitude. She noticed when his study fire had burned low and arranged for it to be tended more frequently. She observed that he took his coffee black and strong in the mornings and ensured that cook prepared it precisely to that specification. When she saw him return from a particularly long ride in freezing rain, she had hot water sent to his chambers without being asked. Adrian never acknowledged these kindnesses verbally, never met her eyes with gratitude or even awareness. But Eleanor began to notice subtle changes. The study door, once firmly closed whenever he occupied it, now stood slightly ajar. And most significantly, most heart-racingly, he stopped avoiding the library during the hours she spent there. She would be reading, absorbed in her book, and would look up to find him entering, claiming a chair across the room with a volume of his own. They did not speak. They did not even acknowledge each other beyond the briefest nod. But they shared the space, and the silence between them felt somehow less hostile, less cold, as though some fragile understanding was being built in gestures too small for words. Autumn deepened into something more severe, the moorland winds stripping the last leaves from the trees and rattling the windows of Greystone Hall with increasing ferocity. The house grew colder despite the fires kept burning in every room, and Eleanor found herself spending even more time in the library, where the fireplace was particularly large, and the walls of books seemed to hold warmth like a living thing. It was there, in that sanctuary of leather and paper and flickering firelight, that the distance between her and Adrian began to narrow by infinitesimal degrees. Their silent companionship became routine over the passing weeks. Eleanor would settle into her preferred window seat in the late afternoon, and within an hour Adrian would appear, taking the leather armchair near the fire with his own chosen volume. They existed in parallel, two readers sharing space but not words, and yet Eleanor felt his presence with an awareness that seemed to fill the room. She learned his habits of reading, how he would frown at certain passages, how his fingers would drum against the armrest when something troubled him, how he would occasionally close his eyes, as if committing a particular phrase to memory. And sometimes, when she glanced up from her own page, she would catch him watching her over the top of his book, his storm-grey eyes holding an expression she could not quite decipher before he looked quickly away. The first words spoken between them in the library came on an evening when the wind howled particularly viciously outside, and the fire crackled with unusual intensity. Eleanor had gasped softly at a passage in her novel, and Adrian had looked up with what might have been concern. "Is something wrong?" he asked, and his voice in the quiet room startled her so much she nearly dropped her book. "No," she managed, recovering herself. "Merely an affecting passage. The heroine has just discovered a truth she had been seeking." Adrian nodded slowly, and for a moment she thought that would be the end of it. But then he said, "You read a great deal." "There is little else to occupy my time," Eleanor replied, and instantly regretted the bitterness that had crept into her tone. But Adrian did not seem offended. Instead, something that might have been guilt flickered across his features. "My mother felt the same," he said quietly. "She said books were companions that demanded nothing but attention." The conversation died there, but something had shifted. Some invisible boundary had been crossed. The next evening, when dinner was announced, Eleanor rose from her chair expecting the usual solitary meal in that vast dining hall. But Adrian rose as well, setting aside his book with what seemed like deliberation. "I will join you," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "if that is acceptable." Eleanor's heart performed an absurd leap in her chest. "Of course, Your Grace." The dinner was stilted, awkward in the way of two people unaccustomed to each other's company attempting conversation. They spoke of safe topics, the severity of the weather, necessary repairs to the tenant cottages, a book they had both read. Adrian's responses were careful, measured, but he listened when she spoke, truly listened, and once or twice Eleanor saw the ghost of what might have been a smile touch the corners of his mouth. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was not coldness either, and as Eleanor retired to her chambers that night, she felt something fragile and dangerous unfurling in her chest. Hope. The storm came without warning, rolling in from the moor with a violence that seemed personal, as though the heavens themselves had taken offense at something and meant to exact vengeance. Eleanor had been in the library when the first crack of thunder split the air, so loud and close it seemed the sky had torn itself apart, and she felt her entire body go rigid with a fear so primal it bypassed all rational thought. She was 8 years old again, trapped in the nursery during the storm that had shattered the great oak outside her window, the tree crashing through the glass in an explosion of thunder and lightning and splintering wood that had missed her bed by mere feet. She had not feared storms before that night. She had feared little else since. The lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the library into darkness, broken only by the fireplace and the violent flashes of lightning that turned the windows into momentary squares of blazing white. Eleanor meant to move, meant to light candles with steady hands and retire to her chambers with dignity and tact, but her body would not obey. She sank to the floor beside her chair, her arms wrapped around herself, trembling with each thunderclap, as though the sound were a physical blow. She did not hear the door open over the storm's fury, did not know she was no longer alone, until Adrian's voice cut through her panic. "Eleanor?" Not Lady Eleanor, just her name, spoken with an urgency she had never heard from him. She looked up to find him kneeling beside her, his face illuminated by candlelight. He must have brought it from the corridor, and his expression showed something she had never seen there before: concern. "The storm," she managed through chattering teeth. "I know it's foolish, but I cannot." Another crack of thunder, and she flinched violently. Adrian did not hesitate. He sat down beside her on the floor, his back against the chair, and to her utter shock, he reached for her hand and held it firmly in his own. "You are safe," he said, his voice steady and calm in the chaos. "The house has weathered worse storms than this. I will not leave you." And he didn't. As the storm raged outside, Adrian stayed beside her on the library floor and did something Eleanor would never have imagined. He talked. He told her stories, his voice low and soothing, painting pictures with words to distract her from the violence outside. He spoke of his childhood at Greystone, of his mother teaching him to read in this very room, of the time he had gotten lost in the East Wing and spent hours convinced the house was haunted before the housekeeper found him. He told her about his horse, Tempest, who was terrified of butterflies but feared nothing else. He described the moor in spring when the heather bloomed, making the landscape purple as far as the eye could see. With each story, Eleanor felt her panic recede, replaced by something warmer, something that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. This was the man he had been before, whatever had frozen his heart, this kind, gentle soul who sat on the floor, holding a terrified woman's hand and talked her through her demons. When the storm finally passed and the violence outside gave way to steady rain, Adrian helped her to her feet with a gentleness that brought tears to her eyes. But as soon as she was standing, as soon as the crisis had passed, she felt him withdraw. The walls went back up, the warmth leached from his expression, and he stepped back as though suddenly aware of the impropriety of what had transpired. "Good night, Lady Eleanor," he said formally, and was gone before she could thank him, leaving her alone with the guttering candles and the certainty that she had glimpsed something real, something true, and that nothing between them would ever be quite the same again. After the storm night, something irrevocable had shifted in the architecture of their marriage, and though Adrian had retreated behind his walls, the walls themselves seemed somehow more permeable, less absolute. Their library evenings became not merely routine but ritual, a sacred hour when the Duke and Duchess of Greystone existed not as strangers bound by contract, but as two readers who happened to share a space and, increasingly, their thoughts. The conversations began tentatively, a comment on a book, a question about an author, and observations that required only brief responses, but they grew like vines, slowly, persistently, until Eleanor found herself engaged in discussions that lasted an hour or more. They spoke of philosophy and poetry, of the ideas that moved them and the passages that had shaped their thinking. Adrian, she discovered, had a mind as sharp as it was careful, and he listened to her opinions with an attention that made her feel, for the first time since arriving at Greystone Hall, that she was more than merely decorative. One evening, as they discussed the management of the estate's tenant farms, Adrian did something that stole Eleanor's breath. He asked her opinion, not as a formality, not as a courtesy, but with genuine interest in what she thought. "The southern parcels need modernization," he said, unrolling a map across the library table. "But Henderson believes the tenants will resist change. What would you suggest?" Eleanor had grown up on an estate, had absorbed more about land management than most women were credited with understanding, and she found herself leaning over the map, pointing out considerations Adrian had not mentioned, suggesting approaches that balanced innovation with respect for tradition. He listened intently, his grey eyes focused on her face rather than the map, and when she finished, he nodded slowly. "That is excellent counsel," he said, and the simple acknowledgement warmed her more than any grand compliment could have. She began to notice other changes, small but significant. Adrian smiled occasionally, now not full smiles, not yet, but slight upward curves of his mouth that transformed his severe features into something approaching approachable. He would catch her eye when he found an amusing passage, sharing the joke silently before returning to his reading. He remembered details she mentioned: her preference for tea over coffee, her interest in botany, her birthday, which arrived without fanfare but with a first edition of a novel she had mentioned wanting. Dinners together became regular rather than exceptional, and the long table that had once emphasized their distance now felt absurdly large, so that one evening Adrian simply took the chair closest to hers rather than retreating to the far end. They spoke of the day's events, of books and politics, and the small observations that make up a life, and Eleanor found herself laughing at something he said, actually laughing, and seeing his expression soften with what might have been pleasure at the sound. The distance between them was narrowing by inches, by moments, by the accumulated weight of small kindnesses and growing comfort, and though Eleanor knew better than to mistake this for love, she could not help but feel that they were building something real, something that might, given time and patience, become the foundation for more than mere coexistence. Eleanor had been watching the gardens through the library windows for months, observing how even in their neglect they held a wild beauty that called to something in her soul. They had been magnificent once she could see the bones of their former glory in the overgrown hedges and choked flower beds, in the stone paths disappearing beneath weeds and the fountain long gone dry. One evening, gathering her courage as she and Adrian sat reading, she ventured the question that had been building in her heart. "Your Grace, I wonder if I might have your permission to restore the gardens. They were beautiful once, and I believe they could be again." The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Adrian's book dropped to his lap, and his face went pale, then flushed, a succession of emotions crossing his features too quickly to catalogue. When he spoke, his voice was rough with something that sounded perilously close to pain. "Those were my mother's gardens. She designed them herself, spent every day tending them. After she died, I could not." He stopped, his jaw working as though the words cost him physically. "No one has touched them in 10 years. Eleanor felt her heart contract at the rawness in his voice. This man who kept himself so carefully controlled, now visibly struggling. "I understand," she said softly. "I should not have presumed." "No." Adrian stood abruptly, pacing to the window to stare out at the darkening grounds. "No, you are right. She would have hated to see them like this, neglected and dying." She always said gardens were living things, that abandoning them was a kind of murder. He was silent for a long moment, his reflection in the glass troubled and distant. "Do as you think best. You have my permission." But permission, Eleanor understood, was not the same as blessing, and Adrian's departure from the library that night felt like a retreat from a battlefield. Nevertheless, she began the work the very next morning, dressed in her oldest gown, with her hands wrapped in gardening gloves that had once belonged to some previous mistress of the house. She worked methodically, clearing weeds and dead growth, uncovering the garden's structure like an archaeologist revealing buried treasure. The work was physical, exhausting, and exactly what she needed: a purpose beyond reading and waiting, a way to leave some mark upon this place that had remained so stubbornly resistant to her presence. For 3 days she worked alone, and then on the 4th she looked up from her task of clearing an overgrown rosebed to find Adrian standing at the garden's edge, jacket discarded, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. "Those roses were her favorites," he said quietly, and without another word he knelt beside her and began to help. They worked in silence at first, their hands moving in parallel through earth and root, and the physical labor creating an intimacy that conversation never had. Adrian's presence beside her felt different here, without the formal barriers of drawing rooms and dinner tables between them. He was just a man working earth, and she was just a woman doing the same. And when their hands accidentally brushed, reaching for the same weed, neither of them pulled away immediately. "She planted this garden the year I was born," Adrian said eventually, his voice soft with memory. "She said every flower was a wish for my happiness." Eleanor looked at him, at this man kneeling in the dirt of his mother's garden, with soil on his hands and something like peace on his face, and felt her heart turn over in her chest. The evening it happened, they had been working in the gardens all day and had come to the library still flushed from exertion, soil still beneath their fingernails despite washing, something loose and unguarded between them that the physical labor had created. They took their usual seats, but somehow Eleanor found herself in the chair beside Adrian's rather than across the room, and he did not move away, did not retreat to a safer distance. The fire crackled between them, and the autumn darkness pressed against the windows, and when Adrian spoke, his voice was lower than usual, more intimate. "I have not thanked you properly," he said, "for restoring the gardens, for caring for something that mattered to her." Eleanor turned to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "They are beautiful. They deserve to be loved." "As do most things," Adrian said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he was no longer speaking only of gardens. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before, raw and real, and achingly honest. Adrian spoke of his mother's death when he was 17, how it had felt like the world had lost all color and warmth. Eleanor shared her own losses, the loneliness of growing up as an only child in a house more concerned with appearances than affection. They spoke of fear, his fear of caring too deeply, her fear of never being cared for at all, and with each confession, the space between them seemed to shrink until Eleanor could feel the warmth radiating from his body and could count the firelight reflections in his grey eyes. "I have been alone so long," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that I had forgotten what it felt like to want something beyond mere survival." His hand moved toward hers where it rested on the arm of her chair, his fingers reaching, trembling slightly, and Eleanor's heart stopped beating as she watched the distance close between them, felt the moment stretching out with unbearable tension. She could see everything in his face, desire and fear, and something that looked desperately like longing, and she held perfectly still, and afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was forming between them. Their fingers were inches apart, then less than inches, and Eleanor could feel the heat of his skin without even touching, could hear his breathing change, and could see Adrian jerked his hand back as though burned and stood so abruptly, his chair scraped across the floor. "Forgive me," he said, his voice ragged, his face stricken. "I should not have. This was inappropriate. I apologize." And he was gone, striding from the library with something like desperation in his movements, leaving Eleanor sitting alone with her hand still extended toward empty air and her heart breaking in ways she had not known possible. She sat there for a long time after, staring at the fire through tears she refused to let fall, understanding with devastating clarity the pattern that had emerged. Closeness followed by retreat, a warmth followed by cold, hope offered and then snatched away. And she understood something else, something that made everything infinitely worse. She had fallen in love with him. Completely, irrevocably, hopelessly in love with a man who would not, could not, let himself love her back. Eleanor avoided the library the next day, unable to bear the thought of sitting in that space where hope had bloomed and died in the span of a breath. She wandered the manor instead, aimless and aching, until she found herself in the morning room where Mrs. Davies was supervising the arrangement of fresh flowers, blooms from the restored garden. Eleanor realized with a pang. The housekeeper looked up at Eleanor's entrance, and something like compassion crossed her usually stern features. "Your Grace," she said, then hesitated in a way that suggested she was debating with herself. "Might I speak plainly?" Eleanor, too weary for formality, simply nodded. Mrs. Davies dismissed the maid with a gesture and turned to face Eleanor fully. "I have served this house for 30 years. I watched the young master grow from boy to man. I was here when—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I was here when he married his first wife." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. First wife, of course, how had she not known? But even as she thought it, she understood no one had spoken of it. No portraits hung in the public rooms, no traces remained of another duchess who had lived and loved in these halls. Catherine was her name. Mrs. Davies continued, her voice soft with old grief. "A lovely girl, full of light and laughter. His Grace adored her. I have never seen a man so completely in love." They had been married 2 years when she fell pregnant, and he was beside himself with joy. Eleanor felt something cold settling in her stomach, knowing already how this story must end. The birth went wrong. The physicians could not save her, nor the child. His Grace. He sat with her body for 2 days, would not leave her, would not eat or sleep. When they finally took her away to prepare for burial, I thought he might follow her into death, so grey and lifeless did he become. Mrs. Davies's eyes, when they met Eleanor's, held decades of witnessed sorrow. "He blamed himself, Your Grace. Said he had killed her by getting her with child. By loving her so much he had wanted to create life with her. He stood at her grave and vowed he would never love again, would never subject another woman to that risk, would never open his heart to that kind of loss." Eleanor's hand found the back of a chair, gripping it for support as the full weight of understanding crashed over her. "That was 3 years ago," she whispered. 3 years, Mrs. Davies confirmed. When his debts mounted, Catherine's illness had cost him dearly, and his grief made him careless with estate management. The solicitors proposed a marriage of convenience, a young woman whose family needed saving, an arrangement that required nothing of his heart. He agreed because he believed he could keep you at a distance, could fulfill his duty without. She trailed off, but Eleanor understood, without risking his heart, without loving, without losing again. "But I have watched him these past months," Mrs. Davies said gently. "I have seen him struggle against what he feels for you. I have seen him retreat every time he begins to care, every time the walls he built begin to crumble. He is terrified, Your Grace, terrified of losing you as he lost her." Eleanor sank into the chair, her vision blurring with tears she could no longer contain. Understanding brought no comfort, no relief, it only made everything worse, because now she knew the truth. Adrian was not incapable of love. He had loved once, deeply and completely, and it had destroyed him. And he had chosen, deliberately chosen, never to love again. And Eleanor, kind, patient Eleanor, who had fallen hopelessly in love with her own husband, was the woman paying the price for another woman's death. Winter arrived at Greystone Hall with a cruelty that felt personal, the moor turning white and bitter, the manor itself seeming to contract against the cold, as though even stone and mortar could feel the chill. Eleanor watched the first snow fall from her window and felt something inside her break with a finality that was almost peaceful, the way ice breaks, clean and absolute. She could not do this anymore. She had tried. God knows she had tried with every ounce of patience and kindness she possessed, had loved a man who refused to be loved, had waited for a heart that had deliberately locked itself away. Understanding why Adrian could not love her made it no easier to bear, and Eleanor realized with sudden clarity that she had been living as a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of a man's existence while her own vitality slowly drained away. She deserved more than this. Not wealth, not title, not comfort. Those things meant nothing when weighed against the simple human need to be seen, to be valued, to matter to someone. and she did not matter to Adrian, not in the way she needed to, not in the way she had foolishly allowed herself to hope for. He might care for her in his careful, distant way, might enjoy her company and appreciate her efforts, but he would never love her, and Eleanor could no longer survive on the crumbs of almost affection he offered between his retreats. The decision, once made, brought a strange calm. She would leave. She would return to her father's house, face whatever shame or difficulty awaited her there, and begin the work of rebuilding a life that belonged to her rather than existing in service to someone else's fear. That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and composed a letter by candlelight, her hand steady despite the tears that fell onto the paper and blurred the occasional word. She wrote with honesty but without cruelty, explaining that she could no longer remain in a marriage that was killing her by inches, that she understood his pain but could not continue sacrificing herself to it, that she hoped he would find peace but could not wait indefinitely for him to find it. She did not write that she loved him, that truth seemed too raw, too vulnerable to commit to paper. She sealed the letter with wax that looked like drops of blood in the candlelight and set it on her dressing table where he would find it. Then, as dawn broke grey and cold over the moor, Eleanor began to pack. Her hands moved methodically, folding gowns and gathering books, placing her few treasured possessions into trunks that would carry her away from this beautiful, lonely place. Each item felt weighted with memory: the shawl she had worn during library evenings, the gardening gloves now stained with soil from the garden she had loved back to life, the first edition Adrian had given her for her birthday. She packed them all with quiet tears streaming down her face, mourning not what had been but what would never be, folding away a life she had hoped for but could not have. Adrian came to her chambers unexpectedly, without knocking, which he had never done in all the months of their marriage, and Eleanor looked up from the trunk she was packing to find him frozen in her doorway, his face a study in incomprehension. For a long moment neither of them moved, and she watched as his eyes traveled from her tear-stained face to the open trunks, to the half-empty wardrobe, to the letter sitting on her dressing table with his name written in her careful script. He moved toward the letter as though in a trance, his hand trembling as he picked it up and broke the seal. Eleanor stood silent, her heart pounding, as he read her words she had chosen so carefully to be honest, but not cruel, to explain without accusing, to free them both from this prison of half-love and careful distance. She watched his face as he read, watched the color drain from it, watched something that looked like devastation replace his usual careful control. When he looked up at her, his grey eyes were wild with something she had never seen there before. Fear. "What are you doing?" His voice was rough, barely recognizable. Eleanor lifted her chin, calling on reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed. "I am leaving, Adrian. I cannot stay here any longer." She used his given name deliberately, a small rebellion, a claim to the intimacy he had always denied her. "I cannot continue to live as a ghost in my own marriage, to exist on the periphery of your life while my own withers away." "You cannot leave," he said, and it sounded less like a command than a plea. "We have an arrangement, a contract that is killing me," Eleanor interrupted, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall again. "I have tried. God knows I have tried to be what you needed. I have been patient, I have been quiet, I have asked for nothing, but I cannot do this anymore. I cannot love you from a distance while you keep your heart locked away in a tomb." Adrian flinched as though she had struck him. "I told you from the beginning not to expect love from this marriage. You agreed to those terms." "And I do not expect love," Eleanor said, and her voice broke slightly on the words. "I have learned that lesson well enough, but I find I cannot live without even affection, Adrian. Without warmth or regard or the simple acknowledgement that I exist as more than a convenient solution to your financial difficulties. You have been kind to your servants, gentle with your horses, but to me, your wife, you have been nothing but a series of walls and locked doors." She turned back to her packing, unable to bear the look on his face any longer. "I release you from whatever guilt you might feel. This is not your fault you were honest about what you could not give me. The fault is mine for hoping that honesty might change." Adrian left her room so abruptly he nearly stumbled, and Eleanor heard his footsteps echoing down the corridor with something like desperation in their rhythm. She stood trembling in the center of her chambers, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to still them, and tried to return to her packing with some semblance of composure. But the clothes she folded now were crumpled by her tears, and she finally abandoned the pretense, sinking onto the edge of her bed to gather what remained of her strength. She would finish packing, she would order a carriage, she would leave this place and never look back. She had to. Survival demanded it. When she had composed herself enough to stand, Eleanor lifted one of her smaller trunks and carried it toward the door, intending to have it brought down to the entrance hall. But when she reached the door to her wing, the door that led to the main corridors of the house, she found it locked. She tried the handle again, certain she must be mistaken, but it would not turn. A cold understanding began to creep through her veins as she set down the trunk and walked quickly to the servant's stair at the other end of her wing. Locked, the door to the balcony that overlooked the gardens. Locked, every exit from her chambers, every possible egress, secured against her. Eleanor felt rage rising in her chest, hot and righteous, and she gathered her skirts and began pounding on the main door, calling out for staff, for anyone who might hear and explain this madness. But no one came, and finally Eleanor understood with absolute clarity what Adrian had done. She found him in the main entrance hall, standing before the great doors as though guarding them, and his appearance shocked her, his hair disheveled where he had run his hands through it, his cravat loosened, his eyes wild with something that looked perilously close to madness. When he saw her descending the stairs, she had found a servant's passage that remained unlocked. He straightened, but did not move from his position, blocking the exit. "I have locked every door," he said, and his voice was raw, stripped of all its usual careful control. "Every exit from the house. You cannot leave." Eleanor's anger blazed so brightly she felt incandescent with it. "You cannot keep me prisoner. You have no right. This is madness, Adrian. You must unlock these doors immediately." "I cannot." He took a step toward her and she saw that his hands were shaking, that his entire body trembled with emotion he could no longer contain. "I cannot let you go." "You have no choice," Eleanor said, her voice deadly quiet now, more dangerous than shouting. "I am not your property to lock away. I am a human being, and I am leaving, and you will unlock these doors, or I swear I will find a way out if I have to break every window in this house." "Eleanor, please, do not Eleanor me now. After months of Lady Eleanor and careful distance, you have made it abundantly clear that you want nothing from me, that I am merely an obligation you fulfill with gritted teeth, and I will not stay where I am not wanted. But you are wanted." The words burst from him like a confession torn from his soul. "God help me. You are wanted. You are needed. And I cannot let you walk out of my life when you have become the only light in it." Adrian's face crumpled, every carefully constructed wall collapsing at once, and Eleanor watched in stunned silence as this man who had been nothing but controlled composure for their entire marriage fell apart before her eyes. He sank onto the bottom step of the grand staircase as though his legs would no longer support him, his head in his hands, and when he spoke his voice was broken, raw with years of suppressed grief and fear. "Catherine died in my arms," he said, the name of his first wife falling between them like a stone into still water. "She bled to death while I held her and could do nothing to save her or our child. I loved her so completely that when she died, I thought I would die too. I wanted to die. And when I survived, when I woke each morning to find myself still breathing, I vowed I would never love again, would never give my heart so completely that losing it could destroy me." He looked up at her then, and his grey eyes were swimming with tears he made no attempt to hide. "And then you came, you with your quiet dignity and your patient kindness, your gentle presence that asked nothing of me and somehow gave me everything. I tried so desperately to keep you at a distance, to maintain the walls I had built, but you slipped through them anyway in the library, in the gardens, in 1,000 small moments when I forgot to guard my heart." Eleanor felt her own tears falling freely now, her anger dissolving into something more complex, more painful. "I felt you settling into my soul like light returning after endless winter," Adrian continued, his voice breaking. "Your tea left in my study, your restoration of my mother's gardens, your laughter when I managed to say something amusing, the way you looked at me as though I were not a monster but simply a man. I was terrified. Terrified that if I let myself love you, I would lose you as I lost Catherine, as that God or fate or whatever cruel force governs the universe would take you from me as punishment for daring to love again." He stood abruptly, crossing the space between them, and Eleanor could see him trembling. "So I pushed you away every time I felt myself getting too close, every time my heart tried to open to you. I told myself I was protecting you, protecting us both, but I was wrong, so desperately, devastatingly wrong. Because pushing you away means losing you anyway, and I cannot." His voice broke completely. "I cannot survive losing you, Eleanor. I love you. God help me. I have loved you for months, perhaps from that night in the storm when you let me see your fear, perhaps from the first moment you looked at me with those dark eyes that saw straight through every defense I possessed." Eleanor's heart was breaking and mending all at once, shattering and reforming into something new. "Adrian," she whispered, and his name on her lips felt like a prayer. "I love you. I have loved you, even when it hurt, even when you retreated, even when I knew I should protect my heart but could not." He reached for her hands, gripping them as though she were the only thing anchoring him to earth. "Stay," he pleaded, and there was no pride left in him, only naked need and desperate hope. "Please stay. Let me spend the rest of my life proving I can be the husband you deserve, loving you the way you should have been loved from the beginning. I will unlock every door, tear down every wall. Just please, please do not leave me." Eleanor looked at this man before her, her husband, this stranger she had loved from a distance, now raw and vulnerable and offering her everything she had ever wanted, and felt the enormity of the moment settling over them both. She did not pull her hands from his, but neither did she immediately acquiesce, because she had learned in these months of loneliness that love without honesty was merely another form of isolation, and she would not trade one prison for another, however beautiful. "I will stay," she said, and watched hope blaze in his eyes before she continued, "but not as I have been living. I cannot return to silence and distance, Adrian. If we are to have a marriage, a real marriage, then we must learn to speak to each other about our fears, our pain, everything we have been holding back. You must let me in, truly in, not just when crisis forces your walls down, but every day, in every small moment." Adrian nodded, his grip on her hands tightening. "Yes, anything, everything, I swear it. And I must be able to trust that when you retreat, because old habits do not die easily, you will come back, that you will fight your fear instead of surrendering to it, that you will choose me, choose us, even when it terrifies you." "I will," he said, his voice fierce with promise. "I swear on everything I hold sacred, I will choose you every day for the rest of my life." He released her hands then and crossed to the great doors, producing a ring of keys from his pocket and unlocking them with hands that still trembled. Then he moved through the entrance hall, unlocking door after door, the literal manifestation of his metaphorical surrender, until every exit stood open to her, every choice returned. "You are free to leave," he said, returning to stand before her. "I will not hold you prisoner, but I am begging you to stay." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she reached for him, and this time, when their hands met, there was no hesitation, no retreat. She stepped into his arms and felt them close around her, with a tenderness that stole her breath. And when he lowered his head to kiss her, their first true kiss, in their first moment of genuine intimacy, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. They held each other in that entrance hall as though they might never let go, and Eleanor felt years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of his embrace, felt his heart beating against hers in a rhythm that promised this was real, this was beginning, this was theirs. They talked through that night, moving eventually to the library where their tentative friendship had first taken root, and there, by firelight, they finally gave each other the truth. Adrian spoke of his mother, of her death that had first taught him that love meant loss, and then of Catherine, not to compare but to honor, sharing memories of a love that had been real and beautiful and had ended in tragedy. He spoke of his guilt, the irrational but powerful belief that his love itself was dangerous, that he destroyed what he cherished. Eleanor listened and held his hand, and finally understood the depths of the wound she was asking him to heal. And she shared her own story, the loneliness of her childhood, her father's betrayal in selling her to save himself, the months of living as a ghost in this house, loving a man who would not love her back. They laid their pain between them like offerings, and in the sharing found that pain diminished, became bearable, became simply part of their story rather than the whole of it. Dawn broke grey and soft over the moor, and Adrian and Eleanor sat together watching the light return, their hands intertwined, their hearts finally, tentatively opened to each other, and the beginning of something real and true and hard-won, unfolding between them like the promise of spring after the longest winter. Spring arrived at Greystone Hall like a benediction, transforming the moor from its winter grey to a riot of colour that seemed to mirror the transformation within the house itself. The manor that had once felt like a beautiful mausoleum now rang with life windows thrown open to admit sweet air, fires burning cheerfully rather than merely functionally, and most remarkably, the sound of laughter echoing through corridors that had known only silence for too long. Eleanor stood in the gardens on a morning bright with possibility, her hands deep in earth as she planted new roses beside the ones they had restored together, and felt Adrian's arms encircle her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder in the easy affection that had become their language. "Mrs. Davies will scold if she sees you've gotten soil on your dress again," he murmured against her ear, but there was laughter in his voice, no real concern. Eleanor leaned back into his embrace, glorying in the simple freedom to touch and be touched, to claim these small intimacies they had been denied for so long. "Then you shall defend me to her, as my husband ought. Always," he promised, and turned her in his arms to kiss her properly, thoroughly, in full view of anyone who might be watching, with none of the restraint or fear that had once governed every interaction between them. These stolen moments had become the fabric of their days, Adrian finding her in the library to steal a kiss between chapters, Eleanor interrupting his work in the study to bring him tea and stay for conversation that stretched into hours, both of them discovering the joy of simply being together without walls or barriers between them. The staff had noticed, of course. Eleanor had overheard Mrs. Davies remarking to the butler that his Grace was a changed man, that she had not seen him smile so much in all her years of service, that the house itself seemed lighter somehow, as though happiness were a physical thing that could illuminate stone and mortar. Adrian was indeed transformed, this man who had been so austere, so remote, now openly doting on his wife with an intensity that might have been embarrassing if it were not so clearly genuine. He brought her flowers from the moor, commissioned a portrait of her in the garden, asked her opinion on every estate decision, and listened as though her thoughts were precious. He was making up for lost time, Eleanor understood, trying to pour months of suppressed affection into every moment they now shared, and Eleanor bloomed under the warmth of his love like the gardens they tended together, her own transformation evident in the brightness of her smile, the confidence in her bearing, the way she moved through the manor as though she finally, truly belonged. They spoke often of the future now, of the life they were building together. One evening, as they sat in the library with Eleanor reading against Adrian's shoulder, he ventured quietly, "I have been thinking about children, if you would want them. I know I once feared—" Eleanor stopped his words with her fingers against his lips. "I would love to have your children, Adrian, when we are ready, when the fear has healed enough." And they both understood that healing was not forgetting, but rather learning to live with scars, to be brave despite them, to choose love even knowing its risks. 2 years later, the gardens of Greystone Hall stood in full magnificent bloom, a testament to patience and care and the transformative power of love deliberately chosen. Eleanor sat in the shade of an old oak tree, her hand resting on the swell of her belly where their child grew, and watched Adrian approach across the lawn with that smile that still made her heart perform small acrobatics in her chest, the smile he wore only for her, open and warm and free of shadows. He settled beside her on the blanket she had spread, his hand immediately covering hers on her belly, feeling for the movements of the life they had created together. "Strong kicks today," he murmured, his grey eyes alight with wonder and joy, and something that looked remarkably like peace. "She takes after her mother." "He," Eleanor corrected teasingly, and Adrian laughed that full, genuine laugh she had worked so hard to coax from him and now heard daily, and pulled her close to kiss her temple, her cheek, her lips. They sat together as the afternoon light turned golden, reading aloud from a book of poetry, his hand never leaving the place where their child moved beneath Eleanor's heart. And she thought of the woman she had been 2 years ago, lonely, resigned, prepared to leave, and marveled at how completely their lives had transformed. Adrian had kept every promise made in that desperate dawn confession, had chosen vulnerability over safety, had learned to speak his fears instead of hiding behind them, and in doing so, had freed himself from the prison of his own guilt. He no longer flinched at happiness, no longer waited for tragedy to strike. He simply loved her, openly and completely, and let himself be loved in return. Dear listener, if you have stayed with us through this journey, perhaps you recognize something of yourself in Eleanor or Adrian, the loneliness of loving someone who cannot love you back, or the fear that keeps you locked away from the very thing you need most. Know this: sometimes the coldest hearts need only patience and the warmth of steady kindness to thaw, but patience must never mean martyrdom. Eleanor's willingness to walk away, to choose herself and her own worth, became the catalyst that forced Adrian to confront what he was losing. Real love requires vulnerability from both people. One person's courage cannot sustain a relationship alone. If you find yourself living as a ghost in your own life, accepting crumbs when you deserve the feast, remember that you teach people how to treat you by what you accept. Walking away is not failure, but rather an act of profound self-respect, and sometimes it is the very thing that makes someone realize what they have taken for granted. But know, too, that some hearts cannot be unlocked from the outside, that you cannot love someone into healing, and there is no shame in leaving when staying costs you yourself. May you find the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to know your worth, and the grace to choose love when it is offered freely rather than parceled out in fearful increments. May you build gardens where once there was only wilderness, and may you know the peace of being loved exactly as you are. Rest well, dear listener, and may your own story find its happiness. This has been a tale from Sweetly Told Stories, where every ending reminds us that love, real love, is always worth the courage it demands.